Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions will be about The Gate of Gods by Martha Wells. And yes, I finally got the third in the series of The Fall of Ilrain, the last in the series. And yeah, I will admit I had to buy a library discard copy, which usually I don't mind, but this time I'm a bit angry because they literally cut a section out of the cover rather than just like scratching through the library barcode. But I got it and I didn't have to pay like $50, so we're winning. But this book, just to warn you, even though it does not start up directly at the end of the last book, it's pretty close, and it is the last of a series, so be prepared that there might be some spoilers in here for the Wizard Hunters and the Ships of Air. But this book, we start with Tremaine, Elias, Gilead, and the others having just made it to Capydara. Now, having made the trip across Ilrain through the Spirian world and back into their world to drop off refugees, they now know it is possible. And they know that they have the ability finally to plan to rescue the people who have been left behind in Ilrain. And with the World Gates, they might even be able to rescue the sorcerers who have been trapped in the University of Luden since the beginning of the war, behind this magic barricade created by the Gardier. But first they need to figure out how to manipulate and adapt the gate spell to allow them to jump somewhere where there's not already a gate spell set up. Luckily they do think they have someone who can do that. Araceld. He is still trapped inside a magical, mechanical spear, but he has been able to help them and communicate with them enough that they're pretty sure he is still aware and willing to help. He's able to give them one more circle. And exploring that circle will take them on a journey that will mirror the one that he took years before that ended with him in this sphere, and which will hopefully tell them how this war started, where the Gardier really come from, and how the three worlds are tied together. And hopefully this will be a journey that will allow Tremaine and the others to end this war before everything they love is destroyed. Okay, so this is one of those books that when I was nearing the end, like when I was about 100 pages out, I was looking at the pages left going, how the hell are we going to resolve this? Like, I knew this is the last of the series, and I really did not expect it to be one of those series that just is super open at the end, where nothing gets resolved. And at that point, it just sort of felt like we were too entrenched in the war. The conflict was too entangled. Especially because Tremaine literally keeps thinking about how even if they accomplish this task or that task, they will still have years and years of fighting ahead of them. And you can feel the weight of the uphill struggle ahead of them in every page. And I've read books like this before where we're getting near the end and I'm going, there's no way that this conflict will be resolved by the end. And sure enough, sometimes it just isn't. Sometimes these books are the ones that, like, half of the plot elements just get left behind. You don't find out what happened to a lot of people, and you're just sort of like, okay, was that the ending? But other times I've read books like that, and they do manage to resolve everything, but it just feels really forced and rushed. Like, everything comes together in completely unbelievable ways and gets fixed with a quick Deus Ex Machina that just, you're like, okay, cool, I guess that's the ending. But this book is neither of those varieties. This is one of the rare occasions where the conflict feels too big to possibly have a satisfying resolution. And yet it does. This book has a really satisfying ending. And it's not just a satisfying ending for the book, it's a satisfying ending for the series. The plots and subplots all are given enough time to feel like they got a complete resolution. The main characters all had fulfilling and interesting arcs that felt like they came to a concluding place. And it's just the kind of ending that I like. There's an implication there will be more future adventures ahead of them. Not everything is wrapped up in a tight little bow, but we still have the feeling that we know what's going to happen with everything. We can see where things are going enough that we aren't left worrying like, oh my god, what's going to happen with that? It is a happy ending, but it's not one of those happy endings where everything is perfect, like there is loss. And I think that's actually very important, because I think the reason some people prefer sad endings is just when everything is too happy at the end, when everything's too perfect, it sort of feels like the barriers set up to the ending, the conflict, had no punch to it. It sort of feels like there was no chance there was not going to be a happy resolution. It's sort of like sitcoms. The reason that you're able to laugh at these people's problems, the reason that none of the conflicts feel really difficult or real, is most sitcoms, at the end of each episode, you reset directly back to the beginning. Yeah, you might worry throughout the episode, like, oh, is Dad gonna lose his job? Are we gonna go hungry? Are we not gonna be able to afford the car? And by the end of the episode, yeah, he's still working the same job, everyone's making the same amount of money, everything seems the same. And because of that, no problems really feel real in those kind of shows. And that's good for a sitcom, because that allows you to laugh and not get too invested in what's going on. But that does not work in a book, which is why I'm always happy when we have a happy ending, where people have experienced real loss. People have experienced real trauma. And sometimes that is literally the loss of characters, the loss of people's loved ones, loss of home, loss of dreams, or even characters losing bits of themselves along the way. And I really love seeing the endings that really do show that there is loss, and because it really shows that a character, and therefore a person, can go through all this terrible trauma. They can lose people, they can have painful suffering. They can go through hell and high water and suffer serious trauma and yet still have a happy ending. Things don't have to be perfect for there to be a happy ending. And that's the kind of ending this book gives us. And weirdly, that transitions me to talking about the title of this book. This book has a perfect title. Like, seriously, I am so impressed that this book has a title that manages to foreshadow what's going to happen in the book without giving it away. And I'm embarrassed to say that it was only halfway through this book, after having read the previous two, that it occurred to me that the titles of these books are from the Spirian's point of view. So, like, I mentioned in the last review, the review of Ships of Air, that these books are really Tremaine's books. And I'll stand by that. She is the main character. She is the one whose character arc is really driving the entire thing. But at the same time, the titles are not hers. Wizard Hunters, that is a description of who Elias and Gilead are. And also the word wizard is used far more by the Spirians than by the Rhaenish people. And Ships of Air, the Rhaenish actually call them airships. And the Spirians actually start by calling them, like, mechanical whales, but Ships of Air is what they call them a little bit, like, feels more like it fits in their world. But then there's the Gate of the Gods. None of the characters ever call anything that, but it fits in the world building of the Spirians. And that's actually a really cool trick, because the majority of this book, like, yes, it's about the war in Ilrain. They are fighting to save Ilrain. The series is called The Fall of Ilrain. But the majority of the book does take place in the Spirians' world. And having the title from their point of view sort of sets them up to be the center and heart of the book, both them and their culture. And that turns out to be very true to what happens in the book. So this title does a truly impressive job of telling us what we should be focusing on and who's going to be important and what's going to be important without ever saying a word of it. It's beautifully subtle. But I also want to talk about a few things about the actual writing. First, Martha Wells did something I very rarely notice in books. This book shows a deep mastery of the differences in body language and culture and levels of intimacy. The Spirians are a very tactile, physical people. They often bump shoulders, they grab each other's shoulders, they wrestle, they sprawl all over each other, etc. And Tremaine actually notices that in the first book, but I only took a peripheral notice of it. The Rhaenish, on the other hand, are very low contact. Like, pretty much the only time they are described as having physical contact with each other is when they actually have to. When they're helping people up, when they are healing people, when they are detaining people. Otherwise, they are not a touchy-feely kind of people. And, like I said, I noticed this a bit in the first book, but it slowly builds up to sort of create this tapestry of each culture. And I've seen a lot of books that show different cultures, and, like, often in the same book. But I don't think I've ever seen a book that, like, really delves in on how people touch each other as being part of culture. And it really is noticeable with Tremaine because she very much starts in the physical world of the Rhenish. She does not touch people, she does not reach out. When Florian touches her, she's a little bit like, eh. But she adapts to the Spirians' way of doing physical contact over the course of the book as she grows more attached to them. And it really sort of highlights the emotional journey of her getting super attached to Elias and Gil. And the same thing is done with the levels of intimacy between the characters. The way Tremaine makes physical contact with Gerard shows immediately that she sees him as a member of the family. She sees him as someone who is close to her. And the way she absolutely never is mentioned making physical contact with Nicholas really clearly shows how little tenderness there is in their relationship. And the way she touches Elias slowly changes across the course of the 3 books to show her feelings developing for him. And that's really important because, spoiler alert here, yes, there's a romance between the 2 of them, and it's a romance where neither character ever says the words, "I love you." So the physical contact is really a major way that we are watching their feelings develop and their relationship develop. The other thing I'm really impressed with here is not just that she's using physical contact as a way of giving a shorthand, but also that it never feels clunky. A lot of times when you're reading a book that has a lot of physical descriptions of what people are doing, how people are interacting with each other, gestures and stuff like that, it ends up feeling really clunky and like we're getting a lot of extraneous information, because often like what they're saying is then like repeated in the way they're moving or something like that. But in this book, often the gestures and the physical contact supplant the actual words. We don't have to hear Gil say, "Hey Elias, how are you doing?" All we have to do is see him bump his shoulder and go, "Okay, we get this." But Martha Wells even manages to have entire conversations happen fully through physical gestures and contact without ever having to revert to saying, "He made a gesture that meant, 'Are you okay?'" Which is something that is impressive. Like, I cannot do that. That is very difficult to do. And all of it felt very natural and human. And it also made this really clear, complex, and realistic part of the different cultures be on full display without her having to constantly remind us of them. And even when we meet the alien, they have a completely separate way of physically interacting with each other. And it's all very brilliant and subtle, and I absolutely loved it. But while I'm talking about relationships, I want to briefly bring up Elias and Tremaine's relationship. So I talked in the other 2 reviews, Wizard Hunters and Ships of Air, about how much I loved the relationship developing between Elias and Tremaine. I felt it was really real and honest and not actually toxic, which is surprisingly rare in books. And that mostly continues through this book, though we very briefly do fall into one of my least favorite traps when it comes to romances, which is the unnecessary drama. There's a moment where one of the characters goes all, "Oh no, this won't work, we need to break up and I need to release you so you can go out and have freedom to do other things." And I hate that BS. It's so, like, it always feels very forced to me, and always feels like characters are kicking themselves in their own balls. There's no need for this. And God bless, every other character immediately calls them out on it. And it's not actually said, no one actually directly turns to them and says, "What the fuck are you doing?" But there's all these gestures and quick passing words that show that 3 or 4 different people all immediately are like, "What are you doing?" And I love it. And the plot very quickly moves on, so we don't have time to dwell on it. And we're moving on to an actual battle situation, so we really don't have time to dwell on it. But also, the relationship is suddenly in actual serious danger because we're not sure if either of them are going to survive. And I really appreciated this because it felt like not only were the characters directly calling out the other character on their shit, but the actual storyline was too. And it also just made me very happy that we didn't feel the need to devolve into stupid, forced romance tropes. I also love the fact that they have continued to be a couple that actually mostly talk their shit out. Like, when they have problems, they almost immediately talk up to each other about them. And I really love that. It's just nice to see a couple that are communicating, that like seem to actually listen to each other and pay attention to each other. And it's legit been a while since I've been this happy about a couple in a book. I also just generally, side note, loved the gender politics of the Sperians and how it affected their relationship. And it just, overall, everything about Elias and Tremaine are a yes for me. They work. Also, I would like to just quickly say, Lord, does Martha Wells love her place descriptions. And I mean, they're lovely. The places sound amazing. There's a lot of diverse, wonderful, magical settings. There's a beautiful contrast in the colors, the textures, the temperatures, the sizes, the density, as well as just the general vibes of the different settings. And they give us insight into the different cultures we travel through and the different places, the different peoples. And I fucking love ruins. And oh my god, this book has even more ruins in it. But I will admit, there does reach a point that I was a little bit like, okay, that's enough that's enough physical descriptions of places. Especially considering there's like one moment where we're literally going into a major action scene and we pause to get an architectural description, and I'm just like, okay, that's too much. That's too much. I skipped that paragraph because objectively, I'm sorry, I don't need to know what the sculptures look like. I need to know if these characters are gonna survive. And yeah, I really needed to know if these characters were gonna survive. I got so drawn into this book. Again, this is another one that I started out with plans of being all like simple, read small sections, not get too drawn in because I have a life to live, I have work, I have other things to do. And yet last night I just picked it up and read like 300 pages straight. I read entirely while I was supposed to be asleep and just kept reading. And even once I was done with the book, I lay there imagining these characters' futures and their backstories and other interactions with them for like an hour after I was done. And I just was so deeply engaged in this book. Overall, I love this series. I love the characters. I loved the worlds. I loved the contrasts of the worlds. I loved the writing. And I already own a couple more of her books because I am definitely going to read more of Martha Wells. She has officially made it to my list of favorite authors. Good book.